Okay, so welcome to video number 2 on the Submarine. Now, as I said, I caught that great white shark when I was 12 years old, and for me it was a very exciting time in my life. It was kind of a turning point in my life, I think. One of the turning points in my life. Anyway, a few weeks later, my father was out fishing with two of his friends, Rodney and Frank. Frank was a mate and Rodney worked for my father. So on this particular Saturday, my mom took myself and my two sisters, Tracy and Cherie. She took us to the movies, and after the movies she said, okay, I'll take you down to Gordons Bay Harbour and buy an ice cream and wait for your dad to come back from sea and see how they did. So we're down in the harbour and we're having our ice creams or whatever, and I see my dad's boat coming back, and it comes idling into the harbour and comes up to the dock. So I walk down to the dock, and Frank, tall, lanky, blonde guy, Frank jumps off the boat and he's walking up the jetty towards me, the pier towards me, to go actually fetch the vehicle and the trailer to get the boat out the water. So Frank, as he passes me, he says to me, Craig, go ask your father what we saw today. So I said to him, what did you see? What did you see? So he says, just go ask your dad what we saw today. Anyway, I amble over to my dad, and he's next to the dock with the boat, and Rodney's still on board. And I say, Dad, Frank said I must ask you, what did you see today? And my dad looks at me with kind of a strange expression on his face, and he said, my boy, we saw the submarine today. And I said, what do you mean you saw the submarine? He said, we saw the submarine today. And he said, ask Rodney. And Rodney was standing next to him. He says, Rodney, what did we see today? And Rodney said, I saw something out there today that scared me, Craig. It frightened me. It was so big. So I say, how do you know it's a submarine? So my dad says, it's impossible not to know. He says, this thing was a meter longer than the boat. He says it was as wide as our boat. And what I didn't tell you in the last video is that people used to say there's two sharks in the bay. They used to say it was Spotty and the Submarine, and they were both similar size, but there was only one shark. And the reason people called it Spotty is because the Submarine on the top of his head, in front of the dorsal fin, had these three white blotches. That's what we were told. Even Uncle Arthur told us this. And my dad said to me, it had the spots on his head, and he says it was literally a meter longer than the boat, and he says literally as wide as the boat. He says, Craig, it's the biggest shark I've ever seen. He said, would never believe it if I didn't see it with my own eyes. So anyway, that was on. Anti-submarine warfare had just begun in False Bay, because my father now wanted to catch the submarine. And obviously I was speaking to Frank as well, and Frank also said, Craig, the shark came right up to the boat. He said it came swimming right past the boat, and his tail was at the back of the boat, and his head was past the front of the boat. He says it was enormous. He says, and they kept talking about the girth. They said the thing was as wide as the boat, and the boat was 1.8 meters wide. So anyway, my dad goes, that week, my dad goes to Uncle Arthur's place, and he says, Arthur, I want your biggest marlin, big game fishing rod and reel that you have. So Arthur's a bit of an eccentric guy, so he says, no, so I don't sell my fishing equipment. So he buys all this equipment, but he never sells it. So my dad says to Arthur, listen, I don't want any of your bullshit. I want the biggest you got, what you got. So we go right into the back of Uncle Arthur's barn, and there's this room which looks like a professional fishing tackle shop. Everything is perfectly, every rod is standing up perfectly, all the reels are gleaming. He's got a workbench there with reels taken apart, and he's obsessed with this stuff. And there's a pearl glass, 130-pound class pearl glass rod, and a Penn 14-0 Senator game fishing reel with like 1,000 meters of Dacron on it. And my dad says, is the Dacron good? So Arthur says, no, that Dacron's never seen the water, it's perfect. It's also 130-pound breaking strain. So my dad says, how much for it? So Arthur said, I'm not selling it to you, but you can use it. So anyway, we go off with this big tunny or this big marlin rod and reel, And on the way home, my dad stops and he buys a big marlin hook. It's about this big marlin hook, and he buys some fishing cable, you know, steel cable. And we get home and he rigs up this trace that's about 10 meters long. And the next weekend we're out there hunting the submarine. And it's myself on the boat. It is Trevor Grant, my father, and Rodney. All could have been, doesn't matter. There was 4 of us on the boat. So we get to Macassar Beach because this is where the submarine used to hang out most of the time over the summer months. And this is right in the summer. So we're at Macassar Beach and we're in 22 meters of water off the water tower. There's a water tower on Macassar Beach in False Bay. And the fishing is kind of slow, but my dad hooks a couple of what they call them St. Lucy's here or something. And we used to call him red stump nose. So he takes one of these red stump nose, he puts a hook through it, and he puts it out live. So there's a float, it's a 20-liter float, black plastic float, and then the cable is attached to the float, and then the line to the rod is attached also to the float. And then this fish is swimming around on the end of the hook, say 9 meters below the surface. So it's a hot day like this. It's calm, the water's calm, I'm getting bored as hell. And we didn't chum in those days. We never chummed for the sharks. We just sitting there waiting. But we at the same spot. My father had seen it the weekend before with Rodney and Frank. Anyway, I hook a striped pajama shark, and I bring it up, and I'm staring down into the depths, and the water's clear. It's 8-9 meters of visibility, and I'm staring down into the depths like that, and I see it's a striped pajama shark, and I'm just bringing it up slowly and kind of playing with it, you know. I'm going to bring it up eventually, take the hook out and throw it back in the water. So it's about 6 meters below the boat, and I stop reeling and I'm just watching it. I'm watching it on the end of the line moving like this, and it's over a meter long. And next thing from the bow, I was sitting on the port side of the boat, and next thing from the bow, something catches a corner of my eye. And I look, and there's the submarine. I can already see, I just see the spots on the top of his head, and I just see this giant, this monster morphing from the deep. And the submarine comes up, and I don't say anything, I'm just watching. I'm mesmerized. And it comes up, and my shark just disappears under the submarine snout. It's like this little, goes under the shark, the submarine snout. Obviously the submarine swallows my shark. My line goes dink, just bites my line off like that. And I go ballistic, and I'm like, Dad, the submarine's under the boat, the submarine's under the boat. And they all looking around confused, like, what the hell is this kid talking about? I said, the submarine is here. And my dad said, are you sure? I said, I just saw it. I just took the fish off my line. It's right under the boat. And next thing, we got our fishing gear, our float, about 12 meters behind the boat. And next thing, you just see this big swirl. This big hole forms in the ocean as the submarine turns and she surfaces. And everybody's like, it's a submarine. And my dad knew immediately it was a sub. You could see it. Its dorsal fin sticking out the water like this. It's a giant animal. You can't even explain it. So the sub comes up, circles around the float a couple of times. My dad jumps into the fighting chair and takes up the rod and clicks it into the gimbet. And he's got this leather fighting harness on, the exact same one that Quint in Jaws uses. And he clips it onto the reel, and he's sitting there waiting. And the sub obviously takes the bait. And at first you see the float sort of like bobbing on the surface, moving slowly on the surface, and then it starts picking up speed. And then once the submarine feels the resistance, it just takes off. And the reel is just screaming like, and I'm looking at this reel, and I'm thinking that there's going to be nuts and bolts and pieces of plastic shooting out of the reel. It was going crazy, and this drum goes flying across the surface of the water. It's like a plume of water coming off it, and it probably runs for about 50 meters across the water, and then it just goes gone. And my dad tightens up on the drag, and he leans into this thing, and he shouts to Trevor or myself, I can't remember even. He shouts us, start the engines and get the anchor up, because how you fight a big shark like that? you can't fight it straight on like that on anchor. It'll just run all the line off. So you lift your anchor up, and then you circle the shark. So you keep the shark in one area basically, and you keep circling and fighting it because it's fighting away from you. So you just keep it in the area. And but before we could start the engines, the shark had run off maybe 150 meters of line, and suddenly it just stopped. No, the reel just kept quiet, and everything went silent on the boat. And the float came up to the surface, popped up to the surface, and we could see it. So my father started reeling the thing in, and we were like, "What the hell? Did it bite the cable off? Did the hook come out?" We didn't know what actually occurred. So eventually, my dad brings it in, and we pull the float out the water. We pull the cable out the water, and I kid you not, that marlin, that hook that's designed to catch 2,000-pound marlin is as straight as an arrow. So it obviously hooked the shark in the jaw, where it didn't it didn't penetrate flesh, and the pressure of the drum going through the water, and the pressure that my father was exerting on it, and also the pressure of the line going to the water, straightened that hook out. That was literally like that, like an assegai, straight as an arrow. And that was our first encounter. That was my first encounter with a submarine. And I wasn't thinking about if it was 24 feet or 23 feet long, but I was just blown away. I couldn't believe I had just seen the submarine, because there's literally a handful of human beings that have seen this animal and actually known what they're looking at. So that was my first encounter with a submarine. It was very exciting, but it gets better, because we get back home, and now my father's more obsessed than ever before. So during that week, he's out going around to every fishing tackle shop in Cape Town, looking for the biggest hooks he can find. And eventually, he comes back home with, I shit you not, he comes back home with hooks this size, 2 big hooks like this, as thick as a man's finger. They don't even look like you can catch anything on them. They're so big. And when he bought them, the guy in the shop said to my dad, what are you going to do with these things? So my dad says, I'm hunting the submarine. And he says, I've had these 2 hooks lying on the shelf here for several years, because I just bought them at some point because they were so big, and I just wanted them as a display. And he says, I can't actually believe somebody's using hooks this size to go out and catch a shark. And anyway, my dad went and bought steel cable from a boat shop. No more fishing cable, proper steel cable, the winch cable that you winch a boat up onto the trailer with. He went and bought copper pipe, which he chopped and formed into crimps. And he made the meanest, greatest, there's a bunch of seals. He made the meanest, greatest shark trace you have ever seen in your life. And we thought we were ready for the submarine. Anyway, story shall continue.